The autumn morning was biting. A 35-year-old man adjusted his tie outside the subway station, his heart racing. In his pocket was a crisp CV and a handwritten note from his daughter. "Good luck, Daddy." His phone flashed. 8:12 a.m. The interview of a lifetime started at 9 o'clock. Suddenly, a woman nearby stumbled and collapsed. The crowd stepped back, phones out, but nobody helping. He looked at his watch, then at the unconscious stranger. In that heartbeat, he knew he'd be late. He dropped to his knees, chose a life over a career, and missed his chance, or so he thought. Mark had learned to live with the suffocating silence of a house that once echoed with the vibrant laughter and gentle humming of his wife, Elena. It had been 3 grueling years since she passed away, leaving him as a lone, weary lighthouse for their 7-year-old daughter, Lily. Every morning was a physical battle against a fatigue that seemed to seep into his very marrow, a deep exhaustion that coffee could no longer touch. The grief was a phantom limb, always felt but never seen. His life had become a frantic, precarious mosaic of part-time struggles, delivering packages in the bone-chilling pre-dawn hours, where the city felt like an empty, frozen tomb, and moving heavy, splintered crates in a dusty, dimly lit warehouse until the clock struck midnight. His muscles didn't just ache. They screamed with a throbbing, rhythmic exhaustion that made every single step feel like a deliberate act of defiance against gravity. He was a man running on fumes, fueled only by the sight of his daughter's sleeping face. He often sat in the dark for 5 minutes before waking her, gathering the strength to be the strong dad she needed. He felt the weight of every bill like a physical stone in his pockets. The peeling wallpaper in their small apartment seemed to record the passage of their struggles, each crack a map of a dream deferred. He often wondered if he was failing her, or if the city was simply designed to break men who had nothing left to give but their love. But today was supposed to be the day the tide finally turned. This wasn't just another job lead found in the back of a newspaper. It was the only interview he'd managed to secure in 6 months of relentless, soul-crushing searching. It was an operations manager role at Vanguard, a global logistics titan known for its prestige and its demand for perfection. The position promised more than just a paycheck. It promised a return to the man he used to be, a man with a future, a man who could provide more than just the bare essentials. Lily had woken up early, her eyes bright with a rare, contagious excitement. She sat on the edge of the bed in her faded pajamas, her tiny, nimble fingers working with intense, adorable concentration to help him pull his tie straight. They shared a breakfast of slightly charred toast in a cramped kitchen, where the refrigerator was a graveyard of unpaid bills and final notices. Every hum of the old appliance sounded like a ticking clock on their survival. A yellow sticky note, curled at the edges, read, "Rent due Friday. Total $1,200. No more extensions." The atmosphere was thick with a hope so fragile it felt like it was hanging by a single, fraying thread over a dark abyss. As he walked toward the subway entrance, the wind bit through his thin dress shirt, mocking his attempt at professional dignity. Across the station, amidst the sea of gray coats and indifferent faces, Sarah, 27, carried the visible, heavy exhaustion of 1,000 corporate battles. Despite her perfectly tailored designer suit and the authoritative air she usually commanded, today she felt dangerously fragile. She was dehydrated, malnourished from skipped meals, and severely sleep-deprived from a week of high-stakes dawn meetings that never seemed to end. She was a woman who held the world on her shoulders, but had forgotten how to breathe for herself. As she reached the top of the steep concrete stairs, the world simply tilted. A sudden, violent wave of vertigo crashed over her, turning the gray pavement into a swirling vortex. Her expensive phone flew from her hand, shattering against the stone like a dropped crystal. She felt the jarring, cold impact as her body hit the ground, and the gray sky above began to spin in sickening circles. People walked past, their heels clicking rhythmically on the stone like a cold, industrial heartbeat. The city was a machine that didn't stop for broken parts. It only accelerated, leaving the fallen behind as mere obstacles to be stepped over. Some glanced down with a fleeting, shallow look of pity before checking their watches, calculating the cost of a delay. Some took out their phones to snap quick, voyeuristic photos for social media, but most simply kept their heads down, terrified of the messy, time-consuming responsibility of helping a stranger in a city that valued speed over soul. The collective indifference was a cold fog that settled over the scene. Mark didn't stop to weigh the crushing cost of his rent against the shallow, ragged breath of this stranger. He didn't calculate the odds or the missed opportunity. He simply ran. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the wet, grimy concrete that instantly stained his only pair of clean dress slacks, the ones he'd spent 30 minutes ironing the night before. He checked her pulse, his own heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He focused on the basics, making sure she could breathe, keeping her airway clear. He slipped off his own coat, exposing his shivering frame to the biting wind, and rolled it into a soft pillow for her head. His phone buzzed relentlessly in his pocket. Interview at Vanguard at 9 a.m. Reminder: lateness results in automatic disqualification. It was 8:24 a.m. The station was 10 minutes from the office, but he couldn't leave her like this. He looked at Sarah's pale, sweat-slicked face, then at the glowing notification on his screen. Seeing Lily's hopeful face in his mind's eye, he took a deep, steadying breath and turned the device face down on the pavement, intentionally silencing the world outside this small, desperate circle of concrete. He chose the human being over the paycheck, even as the fear of being homeless gnawed at his gut. The minutes stretched like long, agonizing hours as they waited for the ambulance. Sarah's consciousness began to return in jagged, painful fragments, like pieces of a broken mirror being slowly reassembled. The first thing she saw wasn't the gray sky or the blurred buildings, but a stranger's face. A man she didn't know, whose eyes were lined with a deep, authentic empathy that felt completely alien in this metallic, uncaring city. Mark spoke in a low, grounding voice, the same steady tone he used to soothe Lily after a nightmare. He urged her to remain still, his hand gently but firmly on her shoulder to prevent her from trying to sit up too quickly. She whispered a frantic, barely audible question about the time, her mind still tethered to the rigid, uncompromising corporate schedules that ruled her existence. Mark hesitated, the weight of his own lost future sitting heavy on his tongue. He knew every passing second was killing his career hopes, but he didn't want her to feel the crushing weight of his sacrifice. He didn't want his kindness to feel like a debt. He simply smiled, a small, sad but kind gesture, and told her to focus on nothing but her own breath. "The world can wait for a minute," he whispered, as much to himself as to her. He watched the shadows of the clouds move over the pavement, feeling a strange, hollow peace amidst the looming disaster of his life. He felt a rare moment of clarity. His worth wasn't tied to his bank account, but to this single, quiet act of protection. The crowd of commuters had almost completely vanished now that they saw someone was handling the situation. The collective guilt of the city had been relieved. leaving Mark and Sarah alone in the wind. The air smelled of impending rain, damp earth, and old rusted iron. Mark reached into his pocket for a tissue to wipe a streak of blood from a scrape on Sarah's temple. But as he pulled it out, Lily's note fell onto Sarah's lap. Sarah's eyes, though still clouded with pain, focused on the messy, bright crayon letters. "Good luck, Daddy. You are my hero. I love you, Lily." Sarah looked at the note, then at Mark's scuffed shoes and the cheap but carefully ironed shirt he was wearing. She saw the man behind the gesture, a man who had everything to lose, but stayed anyway. She looked back into his eyes, her gaze piercing and searching. She asked him, her voice trembling, if he was going somewhere important, somewhere that required a tie and a suit. Mark looked at the note, then at the empty station where his train had long ago departed. He gave a tired, honest smile and said it could wait. He told her that some things in life were infinitely more important than being on time for a meeting. The sacrifice was unspoken, but in the silence between them, it was louder than any shout. When the paramedics finally arrived, their movements were clinical and efficient, a blur of neon jackets and metallic equipment. They moved Sarah onto a stretcher, asking Mark if he was a family member or a close friend. He shook his head slowly, the cold air finally making him shiver now that the adrenaline was fading. He felt the sudden vacuum of purpose once she was in professional hands. He simply told them that she had needed someone, and he happened to be there. He didn't mention the interview. He didn't mention the rent. He didn't ask for a reward. By the time the ambulance doors slammed shut with a heavy final metallic thud, his phone read 9:17 a.m. The interview was long gone. The door had closed. He tried calling the HR department, his voice cracking as he prepared to explain, but he hit a busy signal, the universal sound of a missed chance. A cold dread settled in his stomach as he thought of the yellow sticky note on his fridge. He sat on a cold metal bench, feeling the weight of the city pressing down on him, and typed a short, professional email, apologizing for his absence and mentioning an emergency without providing any heroic details. He didn't want to sound like he was making excuses. He headed to the bus stop, his shoulders hunched against the biting wind, but in the quiet of his heart, he didn't regret his choice for a single second. The rain finally began to fall, a soft, persistent drizzle that seemed to wash away the traces of the morning's drama. Reality crashed back down with a brutal, uncompromising force. Mark spent the rest of the day in a blur of exhausting manual labor, hauling heavy packages up dimly lit, narrow stairs in apartment buildings that felt like prisons. Every step was a reminder of what he had lost. The good luck note in his pocket, once a source of strength, now felt like a taunt, a reminder of a failure he hadn't even earned. He dreaded the evening, dreaded looking into Lily's innocent, hopeful eyes and explaining why the big job, the one that was supposed to fix everything, hadn't worked out. He felt like he had let her down, even though he knew he had done the right thing. He stopped at a grocery store and bought a single apple for her, counting out the nickels and dimes in his palm, his hands shaking from the day's labor. The clerk looked at him with a mix of pity and impatience, a look he had grown to recognize all too well. The fluorescent lights of the store seemed to expose every flaw in his character, every doubt he tried to hide. Meanwhile, in a sterile, quiet, private room at the city hospital, Sarah was fully alert and sitting up. The room was filled with the scent of lilies. Ironic, she thought, as she remembered the note from the man's daughter. The doctors had cleared her of anything serious, citing a combination of acute exhaustion, a minor inner ear infection, and dangerously low blood sugar. Her assistant, David, a man who lived and breathed for Sarah's schedule, stood by her bed with a tablet in hand, his face a mask of professional concern. It was here, amidst the hum of medical monitors, that her true identity was revealed to the staff. She was Sarah Vance, the formidable CEO of Vanguard Operations. She was the woman who decided the fates of thousands of employees, the woman whose company Mark had been so desperate to join. This wasn't a case of some supernatural destiny, but a direct result of Sarah's own humble, grounded habits. Despite her wealth, she lived in a modest apartment near that station and insisted on taking the subway to stay connected to the city's pulse. She believed that a leader who didn't walk the same streets as their employees was a leader who was lost. As she lay in the hospital bed, she remembered everything with startling clarity. The scratchy wool of the coat under her head, the steady, rhythmic warmth of Mark's voice, and the feeling of absolute safety he had provided in a moment of absolute chaos. Most of all, she remembered the note. "Good luck, Daddy." She ordered David to cross-reference the company's interview schedule from that morning, specifically looking for anyone who had failed to show up for a high-level position. She had an intuition, a gut feeling that had made her a billionaire, that the man on the stairs was one of hers. She saw the automated disqualification notice for a Mark Sterling and felt a sharp pang of guilt mixed with profound curiosity. She wondered how many other Mark Sterlings were crushed by the gears of her own company every day. The cold efficiency of her automated systems suddenly felt like a weapon she had turned against the very people she claimed to lead. Her success had built walls that she now realized were keeping out the very souls she needed the most. That afternoon, Mark stood at the school gates, a weary shadow among the other parents. When Lily ran to him, her face beaming with the expectation of good news, he felt his heart break. He picked her up and forced a bright, wide smile, telling her they would talk about it over dinner, a dinner that would be just cereal and the apple. Then, his phone rang in his pocket, a number he didn't recognize. When he answered, a crisp, professional voice from the executive office of the CEO at Vanguard requested his presence at the headquarters immediately. Mark was utterly baffled and, for a moment, defensive. He thought they were calling to officially blacklist him for being unprofessional, perhaps to lecture him on the importance of punctuality in a multi-billion-dollar firm. But the voice was insistent. He arrived at the glass and steel headquarters 4 hours after his original interview time, feeling painfully out of place in his stained slacks and wrinkled shirt. The lobby was a cathedral of corporate power, and he felt like a trespasser in a land of giants. He was escorted past the bustling HR department and taken directly to the top floor, where the air felt quiet, expensive, and intimidating. Sarah sat behind a massive dark wood desk, looking worlds away from the vulnerable woman he had seen on the steps. She looked him in the eye for a long moment, then told him he had already passed the most important test a leader could ever face. Mark was utterly, completely confused. He stood there, his hands shoved deep into his pockets to hide their shaking. Sarah stood up and walked around the desk, no longer acting like a CEO, but like a human being. She spoke of the hundreds of people who had walked past her, people with impressive titles and expensive watches who didn't even slow down. Out of everyone in that station, out of all the professionals heading to their high-powered jobs, you were the only one who didn't check the time before checking my pulse. You traded your future for the safety of a stranger. Why did you stay, Mark? You knew what was at stake for you. Mark didn't use corporate buzzwords or talk about social responsibility. He simply said that if his daughter ever fell in a crowded place, he would pray to God that someone wouldn't check their watch first. He said he couldn't teach his daughter to be a good person if he wasn't one himself. The room went silent, a raw, unvarnished confession of the values that governed his life, even when the world was trying to crush them out of him. Sarah felt a lump in her throat she hadn't felt in years, a sudden realization that her world was built on the backs of people like him. Sarah didn't just hand him the job out of a sense of personal gratitude. She was too smart a leader for that. She knew that a company built on favors alone would eventually crumble under the weight of its own incompetence. She valued competence as much as she valued character. She sat him down right there in her office, with the city skyline sprawling behind her like a vast, glittering map of ambition, and conducted a rigorous, intellectually demanding interview. She didn't hold back. She asked him about complex global logistics, about managing teams under immense pressure, and how he would handle a crisis that didn't have a clear solution. Mark, stripped of his initial nervousness by the sheer, surreal absurdity of the day, answered with a level of grit, honesty, and clarity he had never felt before. He didn't try to use empty jargon. He spoke about the human element of logistics, the warehouse workers, the drivers, the real people who made the numbers move. He spoke about the exhaustion he knew firsthand. He admitted his weaknesses, spoke about the hard-earned lessons he had learned from the warehouse floor, lessons about efficiency, loyalty, and the human cost of logistics. He explained how he solved problems when resources were thin and time was running out. It wasn't a polished, robotic performance, but a genuine, powerful conversation between two people who understood what it meant to struggle and what it meant to lead. As the sun began to set, turning the floor-to-ceiling glass walls into sheets of orange and gold fire, Lily sat in the lobby downstairs. The head receptionist, moved by the little girl's story and her quiet, patient demeanor, had given her a pad of high-quality paper and some professional markers. Lily drew a picture of her dad, not as a delivery driver or a warehouse worker, but as a giant, standing tall and strong, helping a lady up from the dark shadows. She drew a golden heart inside his chest. It was the only way she knew how to describe him. When the interview finally concluded, Sarah walked Mark out to the lobby herself, a gesture that caused a ripple of whispers among the staff. They had never seen the Iron CEO personally escort an applicant. She saw Lily and stopped, looking at the drawing. She realized then that Mark's character wasn't something he put on like a suit for an interview. It was a legacy he was building for his child, brick by brick, through every small, unseen act of kindness. The drawing captured a truth that no resume could ever convey. Sarah turned to Mark and offered him a 3-month probationary period as the operations manager. She made it very clear that this wasn't a thank you gift for saving her life. She told him that she was hiring him because he had proven he could choose people over opportunity. And in her eyes, that was the only true definition of leadership. "I can teach someone logistics," she said, her voice steady and full of respect. "But I can't teach them to care. Our company has plenty of managers, but we have very few leaders. You, Mark, are a leader." Mark looked at her, his eyes welling with a relief so profound it felt like a physical weight had been lifted from his chest. He thought of the sticky note on the fridge. He thought of Elena. He thought of the future he had almost given up on. He shook her hand, his grip firm and steady, and promised her that he wouldn't let her down. He walked out of the building feeling 10 feet tall, the city lights below looking like an invitation rather than a threat. The polished marble floor beneath his feet felt like solid ground for the first time in years. He felt the phantom limb of his grief finally being supported by a new purpose. A few weeks later, a new morning dawned over the city. The air was still cold, but the biting edge was gone, replaced by the crisp promise of a new season. Mark's kitchen felt brighter, warmer, and was filled with the rich, comforting scent of fresh coffee and real breakfast. The rent was paid in full, the final notice signs were gone, and the fridge was finally full of healthy food and even a small cake for dessert. Mark stood before the mirror and adjusted his tie with a steady, quiet confidence he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just wearing the suit. He owned it. Lily stood next to him in a brand-new, stiff school uniform, her backpack slung over her shoulders with a sense of immense pride. Their home had shifted from a place of fragile, desperate hope to a sanctuary of unshakable strength. The silence was no longer suffocating. It was peaceful, filled with the quiet rhythm of a life being rebuilt. They were no longer just surviving. They were living. Mark walked into the Vanguard building through the front doors this time, not the service entrance. He was a man who belonged. The security guards nodded to him, recognizing the new manager. Near the elevators, he ran into Sarah. She was surrounded by a retinue of ambitious executives and busy assistants, all clamoring for her attention, but she stopped the moment she saw him. The hallway went quiet. They weren't just a CEO and an employee. They were two people who shared a life-altering moment that had redefined both of their worlds. Sarah looked at him and thanked him again, not for the rescue, but for the reminder. "How's the new role, Mark?" she asked. Mark smiled, a genuine, confident smile. "It's challenging," he said, "but we're making progress. We're looking at the people behind the numbers now." Sarah nodded, a look of pride in her eyes. "Good," she said. "That's exactly what we need. We need someone who remembers what it's like on the ground." The culture of the company was beginning to change, one decision at a time. The story ends with a cinematic, heart-swelling image of Mark and Lily walking through the sun-drenched, soaring glass lobby. The light reflected off the ceilings, symbolizing a clear, vast future. He hadn't become a millionaire overnight, and the grief for Elena was still a part of him, a quiet ache that reminded him of why he worked so hard. But a massive door had been opened because he chose to be a human being first, when it mattered most. Success, as Mark now knew, isn't always about being on time for a meeting or climbing a corporate ladder. It's about having the quiet courage to stay when the rest of the world runs away. He had missed his dream interview, but in doing so he had proven he was the only man truly qualified for the life he was always meant to lead. He looked at Lily, then at the building around him, and finally, for the first time in 3 years, he truly believed that everything was going to be okay. They walked out into the sunshine together, a hero and his daughter, ready for whatever came next. The shadows of the past were long, but the morning sun was stronger. Every step they took together was a victory over the darkness that had once threatened to consume them. CTA, HITL Stories. If this powerful story of integrity and sacrifice touched your heart, please hit the like button and subscribe to HITL Stories for more emotional and inspiring journeys. What would you do if you were in Mark's shoes? Would you stay to help a stranger, or would you rush to save your career? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Remember, a single act of kindness can change a life forever, sometimes even your own. We'll see you in the next story.